We're now being joined from Arise Abuja studios by Economist and Chief Executive Officer Diary Hills Limited, Kelvin Emmanuel, to look at the parameters behind the latest rebasing of the gross domestic product figures around Nigeria's economy. Good morning and welcome to the Morning Show, Kelvin. It's great to have you join us. Now, let's begin with the whole idea of GDP rebasing, first of all, just briefly explaining what that is. And then once that's done, why is basically rebasing the GDP back to 2019 so important? Is it possible that we might actually realize post-2025 that our economy is much larger than it is on paper at this time?
Good morning, Kachi. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning to you, Oji, and good morning to you, Steve.
Good morning.
It's always a privilege to be here. So GDP basically is, a sum total of goods and services, when you calculate it at the current prices. And the nominal GDP is the sum total. The real GDP is adjusted for inflation. And what they basically do is move forward the base year to account for current realities in the markets. And if you look at the history of GDP rebasing in Nigeria, you see that within the last 50 years, Nigeria, the first GDP rebasing was done in 1975. And Nigeria's GDP was rebased to $27 billion. The second GDP rebasing was done in 2014, and they used the base year of 2010, and it was rebased to $574 billion. And then now the next GDP rebasing that is being done, we're using 2019 as the calendar year because, they felt like 2019 was the year before COVID. It was the most stable Nigeria had experienced in the last, I'll say, 9 to 10 years. There's projection that GDP is going to rise from $188 billion, where it's currently at, to anywhere around maybe $375 or $385 billion. Those are the projections. And when you adjust it for inflation, it might go up to anywhere around maybe $587 billion. But the reason why GDP rebasing is important is because, number one, when you rebase the GDP, you'll be able to get metrics like GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is basically your GDP divided by the population of the country. So if you divide GDP of Nigeria, for example, currently by the population, you get the GDP per capita. And what that does, it helps business people and investors to understand, when they say there's a gap in the market, the next question they ask is there a market in that gap? Do the people actually have the spending power, the purchasing power parity when you compare for the exchange rate differences, to be able to accommodate for goods and services in an economy? So if you look at the drivers of GDP, for example, GDP growth, you have consumer spending, you have investments, domestic investment, you have foreign investment, FPIs, FDIs. FPIs, which is where foreign portfolio investments are what you call the hot money, which typically doesn't stay for more than 18 months to 24 months. Then FDIs are more patient and slow capital that stays for a longer period of time. Those are the ones that have boots on the ground, Then you have government spending. Government spending talks about how much of the budget is performing and how much of that budget actually goes into the real economy. Then you have balance of trade, which is the difference between your import and exports. So when you look at these different GDP drivers, the question you're going to ask yourself is, how do you account for consumer spending over the last 6 years, considering that per capita income dropped from $2,100 in 2019 to about $835 today, GDP per capita in Nigeria? How do you account for investments? FPIs, you've seen FPIs go in and come out of Nigeria. That's the reason why you've seen the Naira, not appreciated so far, even if the dollar index has been dropping significantly and the Naira is not responding to the global drop in the US dollar index. How do you account for government spending, given that the government has missed its revenue estimates significantly and the National Assembly has had to, modify the capital expenditure implementation window from June 2025 to December 2025. There's been improvement in balance of trade. Nigeria is exporting more because of the exchange rate and the stability in the FX markets. But all of these metrics are what drives GDP growth And GDP rebasing is, like I said, is basically just moving the accounting year to account for the sum total of goods and services at current prices.
All right, let's talk about expectations, Kelvin, as an economist. I'd like to know how you expect this rebasing to, specifically reveal shift into contributions like, towards the digital economy or even the creative industries. I know you might not really elaborate on creative industries, but I think digital economy could be your part. And what challenges do you foresee in accurately capturing these previously underreported or even overlooked sectors? Given that the new figures are expected to be announced on July 11th, what are your immediate expectations for the overall size of Nigeria's economy post-rebasing? Do you also anticipate a substantial increase in the nominal GDP figure?
Moji, thanks for that question. First of all, I'll tell you that data is a major challenge in Nigeria. And I also have a problem, and this is a question I've raised with Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, MBS. I have a question with the CPI rebasing, because the CPI, cost price index, which measures inflation, plays into GDP, because your real GDP is basically your, accounting for total sum of goods and services at current prices adjusted for inflation. The inflation, for example, Moji, has been rebased severally. It was first rebased around that same window of 1975. Then it was rebased again in 2003. It was rebased again in 2009. And the last one was done in 2024. And what I find funny with what the MBS did was that MBS said they moved food from 60% as a weighted composite contribution to the index to 51.8%. Then MBS went and grouped water, housing, electricity, gas, and fuel into one basket and weighted it at 16.7%. I find it very funny. And the reason I find that funny is because that was what brought down significantly the inflation rate, which the CBN, for example, the Monetary Policy Implementation and Technical Committee has not responded to, because they don't believe those figures, for example. Because the CBN, they operate what they call inflation targeting, which means that they always align the monetary policy rate at 4% band to the inflation rate downwards. So it means that if they believe the MBS figures, they would have cut interest rates to about 18.5 or 19%. Okay? So MBS is simply saying that water, housing, electricity, gas, and fuel. Gas is mostly your LPG. And fuel. Fuel price in the last 24 months went from 197 naira to 900 and about 14 to 20 naira, 920 naira in Lagos. How are you weighting fuel at less than 5% in the index for calculating cost price index in Nigeria? So there is a fundamental disconnect in the way MBS has rebased the inflation, which has an impact in the nominal and real GDP. So, for example, when it comes out, you might see nominal GDP at anywhere around 385 billion, and you might see the real GDP go to anywhere above $570 billion. But the problem with this is the GDP rebasing is important, like I said earlier, for investors to be able to check if there's a gap in the market and the spending power and purchasing power parity of the people, whether to invest or not to invest. It's also important for them to check what they call debt to GDP ratio. So, for example, the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007, places a ceiling of 40%. So what it simply means is that if you rebase and the GDP is revised up, it means that the debt to GDP ratio will be revised down from the current 51.87%, which is what I calculated most recently, down to maybe less than 35 or 30%. But the implication of that is that your GDP, your debt to GDP being revised also means that your tax to GDP and revenue to GDP, will also be revised downwards, which means that the government has a higher target to meet, and your interest on debt, your debt servicing to revenue ratio, which we've seen it go up to 165, dropped to 147, came down to 118, came down to 99. then drop to 65%, is also going to go up. You know, so for me, it's a double-edged sword. And the government, in trying to rebase GDP and create an opportunity to borrow more to fund deficits in the budget, which is one of the objectives of rebasing GDP, basically, you know, and attract more investors to come in. You know, they also need to realize the other edge of the sword, which means that the revenue to GDP and tax to GDP is also going to be revised downwards.
All right.
All right, very interesting, Kelvin. But then I know that every country, you know, indulges in rebasing exercise. But then, will you say that after 2024, coming for Nigeria now to rebase, is it like a response to Africa's Big Five? You know, the countries of the Big Five, aside Ethiopia, the three others. Now are said to have bigger economies than us: South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria. So on the 11th, next Friday, when MBS releases, you know, the new rebasing structure, is this to say that we are back to being number one? How realistic? You've already said that, you know, CBN, for example, hardly believes in what they are doing. But how realistic will this be to an average Nigerian? Yes, to investors, I get your point. But to an average Nigerian, how realistic is this, other than to say that, oh, Nigeria, we are the biggest in terms of the size of the economy and GDP?
Steve, it's like you having a plane ticket and not having a visa to fly. If, for example, the country you're going to requires you to have a visa, then one of the problems of having a very poor, weak passport, the green passport, you know, there's no like advantage in being named number one economy in Africa if your per capita income is under $900. And if Nigerians are actually spending nearly everything they earn to buy food and pay for fuel, you know, and they are barely able to pay for data. They're having to borrow money to pay for data and airtime. You know, that's where we are today. The reality on the ground, Steve, is that when you look at the metrics, debt servicing to revenue ratio, when you look at debt to GDP, for example, the FRA is very clear. FRA places a 40% ceiling on debts to GDP ratio. Nigeria has exceeded it. It's at 51.87%. Okay? The FRA Act Sections 41 is very clear on this. And I'll tell you, Steve, you see, one of the reasons why Nigeria's GDP was revised downwards to $188 billion is because of the FX revaluation. And it came from lack of revenue for the government to fund its budget, which led to the past CBN management, for example, not getting the income from the government-owned enterprises. You know, if you look at sections 45 of the Financial Responsibility Act of 2007, you see where it talks about an annual cash plan that the Minister of Finance, the coordinating Minister of the Economy, is supposed to create from the Appropriation Act that will show you like a cash flow waterfall of how the government gets revenue. If you look at sections 22 of that Financial Responsibility Act too, you will see where it also talks about the General Reserve Fund, where any operating surplus generated by MDAs in Nigeria, they are supposed to keep a fifth of that, like in a General Reserve Fund, and pay back for 1/5 of it, or 80% of that, back into the Consolidated Revenue Fund. But what you've had, Steve, which is one reason why you also see revenue impairment in the succeeding financial years for the government, is you've had a situation, for example, where this 4/5 of money that is supposed to be operating surplus sent back to the CRF is actually used as service-wise votes and as constituency projects, as a quid pro quo with National Assembly for oversight functions that National Assembly is supposed to perform on these MDAs. You know, so you have misallocation of resources in a very tight budget period. You know, crude oil price is not at benchmark of $75 a barrel. They have obligations about 294,000 barrels per day that goes into paying forward sale agreements on crude that was borrowed through revenue, resource-backed loans, crude oil-backed loans, you know. So what you had under Emmanuel, for example, was a situation where Emmanuel had to, you know, raise money from public sector private sector CRRO raised cash and reserve ratio up to 32.5%. Now it's 50%. And then he had to also print money up to 17.3 trillion between 2019 and 2022. And that led to a devaluation of the naira, which also rebased the GDP downwards, and revised up the Financial Responsibility Act threshold on debt to GDP ratio. So at the end of the day, Steve, this thing cascades and boils down to how Nigerian government mobilizes revenue to fund budget, how fiscally responsible and disciplined it is in managing its budget. One thing I would give Bola Tinubu his flowers for is in backing Taiwo Oyedele on tax reforms. The Tax Act is a reality today. It has a 6-month sunset. It's going to start implementation 1st January 2026. It says that all 63 MDAs, for example, by law right today, are obligated to collapse their revenue collection functions into the Nigerian Revenue Service, including the Nigerian Customs Service. So if we go up with that and we can significantly increase our tax to GDP ratio to 18% over the next 5 years and reduce the dependency on borrowing through several means of borrowing, resource-backed loans, and quantitative easing at CBN, or the other ways and means, Section 38 of the CBN Act of 2007, and other concessionary loans, bilateral and multilateral lending, we'll see these macro metrics begin to improve, and it will begin to cascade gradually from the macro level to a micro and nano level.
Okay, now how would you say policymakers can use the rebased GDP in economic planning? How should all these development plans and forecasts be revised based on this new data that we'll be getting?
I'm sorry, Kachi, I didn't get that, please. Can you say
So basically, I talked about how policymakers can use this rebasing in their economic planning. So with regards to their development plans, how would these new figures improve their data analysis for their economic planning?
So, for example, I think now we're on TV, I will encourage the Minister of Budget and National Planning, Atiku Bagudu, to release a National Living Standards Survey for everyone to see what the numbers on living standards is in Nigeria. It will definitely improve the per capita, because when you rebase the GDP up and you divide it by the population growing at 30% every year, it will improve the GDP per capita. But the problem is, what is the National Living Standards Survey saying about the quality of life of Nigerians? And then you also have to look at the CPI basket. I don't believe the CPI basket because, like I said earlier, I think it's an anomaly to classify fuel, gas, house rents, housing, electricity and water as 16.7% of the entire basket when petrol prices went from 197 to 920, 930 within 24 months. But what it will help to do in the medium term is that it will help to assure investors that they can bring in capital, that the per capita income of Nigerians have improved. It will also create more room by bringing down that debt to GDP ratio back down below the fiscal responsibility ceiling of 40%. It will also improve the numbers on the debt servicing to revenue ratio, which is currently at 65%. I think is more. So those are the metrics it will improve on the macro level for the government as they look at their numbers and they look at the budget performance that has missed projections for 2025 Appropriation Act so far.
All right, Kelvin, let's touch more on revenue mobilization and capital formation. And of course, the debt profile of Nigeria, given Nigeria's low revenue to GDP ratio compared to regional and global averages, like you've highlighted. I would like to know, because you've touched on policy now, what specific policy reform are most crucial when it comes to enhancing domestic revenue mobilization, particularly in the non-oil sector, because we've been talking about the oil sector and boosting revenue, and also speaking about capital formation. How does an increase in that sector, the non-oil revenue sector, impact gross capital formation?
Oji, very, very, very important question. But I'm afraid we can't talk about revenue mobilization and capital formation without talking about oil and gas, because it constitutes about 80% of your FX currently. For one, I think that the Nigerian government needs to take collapsing the Nigerian Customs Service into the Nigerian Revenue Service seriously, as stated by the Tax Act. there is a lot of under devaluation of the value of consignments and cargoes that come to Nigeria, deliberately, by saboteurs and non-state actors, that like it cheats Nigerian government of revenue when you calculate import duty, okay? And that was why a few years ago, MFL, our former CBN governor, introduced what they call the price verification system to be able to use global benchmarks across other custom territories and HS code to align and match that fraud. It will be able to plug it. But it became more of a bottleneck than a solution. I think the CBN should come back with it, because the Nigerian government is cheated of trillions of naira in revenue on a yearly basis because of under devaluation of the value of consignments that comes into Nigeria. So that's one leakage that we can plug. The next leakage that has raised a lot of uproar is diversifying maritime operations to the Eastern Maritime Corridor. But I wouldn't dwell on that. I'll quickly move on from that. The government also has to look at the oil and gas sector and plug in the leaks in the oil and gas sector. I think last week, Bayo Ojulari at Oil and Gas Week was talking about the fact that the forward guidance for NNPC is that he wants a situation where you will see the government begin to move away from resource-backed loans where you pledge crude oil to get upfront cash to fund all kinds of capital projects or budget deficits in the government budget, and move on to project financing to actually increase production. And he has a target of about 3 million barrels, I think, by 2027 or 2030. You also have to independently, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Petroleum, set up an hydrocarbon accounting framework to look at all the pain points in the upstream fiscalization and plug the loopholes of where Nigeria loses crude oil. And importantly, Oji, today, in the cascade of the cash flow waterfall for daily crude allocation, 804,000 barrels, 294 goes to loans, 300,000 barrels goes to subsidy. What that subsidy payment is meant for, I don't know, because 205 removal, implementation of 205 in the PIA means that the government is no longer paying subsidy on petrol, and the market has moved to a fully market-based pricing system, and nobody's subsidizing anything. So the Nigerian government should come and explain why it says it's using 300,000 barrels per day today in the daily crude allocation to pay for petroleum subsidies. Then you also have pipeline security. 78,000 barrels a day. It doesn't make any sense. They should come and explain how they are using that. So if you look at what effectively comes to the government as revenue, you're looking at anywhere around 131,000 barrels, which comes as tax oil and royalty oil to NUPRC and Federal Inland Revenue Service. So the government needs to be transparent. The government needs to declare everything that comes to FAC to the Federation and not under-declare revenues, or come up and explain to Nigerians if there's been an under-declaration of revenues that comes to FAC since 2023.
All right, Kelvin, if you're to hazard a guess, what will you be expecting MBS to say on the 11th, next Friday? In which sectors of the economy do you think that they will have captured significant shifts in their contributions to the economy? And then what will you say to ordinary Nigerians who will say, when it comes to the GDP and you're rebasing, it goes up. But then when it comes to inflation and unemployment, you are claiming that there's a significant reduction. What will you say to average Nigerians who will be slightly curious as to what will happen when these figures are released next Friday?
Steve, I expect that the NBS will say that, refining, Dangote is being the most important factor for 2024 for the Nigerian economy. The refining, and the exports. Today, Dangote is the largest exporter of Jet A1, automotive turbine kerosene TK jets, which are used for aircrafts and aeroplanes, to the UK. And is a major exporter to the European Union. It's also exporting to the US. And Aramco Trading, which is one of the biggest commodity trading companies around the world with a market value of about $30 billion, is taking significant volumes from Dangote. So if you look at the balance of trade, which has reflected a surplus, you can credit the activities of Dangote around white transportation fuels and urea as a big factor in the numbers we've seen, for the improvements we've seen so far in the total value of goods and services at current prices, adjusted for inflation, of course. For Nigerians who are, asking questions, that, the numbers, the government keeps flying all these numbers and they're not seeing real improvement in their lives, in disposable income, in inflation. Inflation, and MBS says inflation is coming down, but food inflation in Lagos is the highest I've seen in Nigeria. Anytime I visit Lagos and I see the food inflation, I wonder if Lagos is part of Nigeria. That's also because, Lagos is a small city. It has only 30,527 square kilometers and it has about 20 million people. So the population per capita, the humans per capita is very high, It's understandable that a lot of the food consumed in Lagos actually comes outside from the state, and the cost of logistics of bringing in is very high, But Nigerians are asking, how are you putting all these numbers out, telling them inflation is coming down and their per capita income, for example, will be revised up because of rebasing of GDP divided by population, but their quality of life is not improving, which is the reason why I'm challenging Atiku Bagudu, the Minister of National Planning and Economic Planning, to release National Living Standard Survey reports so that Nigerians can see the reality of what the metrics for their quality of life currently is today.
What will that reality show us? Will it show 25% of the population managing to stay afloat? And of course, expectedly, 75% of the population or more are living terribly. Is that what you think that Mr. Bagudu should release to Nigerians? Confront us with the reality?
Steve, I think that the last 5 to 6 years has practically seen the middle class in Nigeria almost disappear. It's either you're rich or poor in Nigeria. The poverty rate has gone up. People are barely able to even eat food. At least people should be able to eat food. I was in China last year and I was shocked. China is experiencing deflation. There's too much goods and less money chasing goods. So the government has to reduce interest rates to stimulate domestic spending. Food is so cheap in China, it's unbelievable. If everything else fails, people should be able to afford to eat food. Steve, Nigerians are barely able to eat. And this is like, it should be a statement to the president, because Bola Tinubu, he thinks he has all the time. He doesn't have all the time. He's going to go, whatever personal possessions he has, nobody's going to care about that. People are going to care about his legacy and impact on their lives. He doesn't have all the time to make a difference. If his people are telling him that things are going well, I should tell him today that things are not going well. Nigerians are not able to eat food. Things are not going well. His Minister of Agriculture is underperforming drastically.
Kelvin, I'm tempted.
And food inflation is high.
I'm tempted to say that if a minister is asking the president to release a certain report about the NDDC or something and things like that, maybe this is the sort of a report that everybody should be shouting should be released, so that we can ask Mr. Atiku Bagudu, to show to us where we are, in terms of our reality. I hope you got my point.
The reality is stark.
Yeah.
Yes, I get your point. The reality is stark, Steve. It's stark. Sometimes if people stay in cities, cosmopolitan cities, Lagos, Port Harcourt, Abuja, which is practically the 3 cities Nigeria revolves around, and think that the people in Kafanchan or Biu or in Jimeta in Yola or the people in Inewi in Anambra are doing well. They are not doing well. They can't eat food. They're not able to afford food because inflation is through the roof.
That's a valid point, Kelvin,
So we
Emmanuel.
shouldn't be deceived by the big parties and the Owambes and all those things that people are saying. See where they say they're hungry, but parties every day, every night. We shouldn't be deceived.
Unfortunately, the reality of the rich that are able to drink Dom Perignon and champagne is not the reality of the poor man that is looking for money to buy a module of rice to eat, Steve. We need to confront the reality that food inflation is higher than the MBS is reporting, and Nigerians are barely able to use their disposable income to buy food because of inflation.
This is a valid point.
That is not properly captured.
I think this is also,
And until we address...
This is also similar to what the IMF was saying.
Because
when they were talking about us recalibrating the realities of our 2025 budget, as a lot of the prices do not reflect realities. But Kelvin, Emmanuel, I have to say a big thank you to you for joining us on the morning show this morning. Thank you so much for your insight and your analysis.